try your best not to say, I'm not smart enough. You are.
You're listening to the Happy Doc Student Podcast, a podcast dedicated to providing clarity to the often mysterious doctoral process. Do you feel like you're losing your mind? Let me and my guests show you how to put more joy in your journey and graduate with your sanity, health, and relationships intact. I'm your host, Dr. Heather Frederick, and this is episode 49. In this episode, I welcome Dr. Tim Stafford, who holds a PhD in Educational Instructional Design for Online Learning and is a doctoral dissertation chair, program director of the MS in Instructional Design and Technology, and associate professor in the School of Leadership, Education, and Communication at St. Thomas University. For the past 30 years, he has been an educational leader and innovator with an emphasis in leading educational technology and e-learning development teams for blended and asynchronous learning environments, institutional technology rollouts, accreditation, curricula development, and development of professional learning environments and infrastructures. Tim pioneered work on innovative designs for schools that would deliver curricula to children of expats serving all over the world in various military and missions groups, and has overseen the design and development of virtually blended schools that currently service children in 16 countries. He has also overseen the development of professional learning systems for national trade associations, including the American Institute for Architects and the National Society for Professional Engineers. His research interests include e-learning systems, Delphi studies and their use in educational metrics, connectivism, instructional design for online learning, educational technology, learning forensics, digital literacy, and the connection of epistemology and learning. Tim, welcome to the show.
Hey, good to be here. This is such an honor for me to be on the Happy Doc podcast. I feel like I've listened to a bunch of the episodes, and to be on it is an honor. So thanks for having me.
Well, I'm really excited to have you on because we did a little bit of talking before the show, and today we are going to talk about the 4 U's.
Right. The 4 U's of great dissertation research. I have 2 conversations with all of my students. The very first one includes finding out a little bit more about them, why they're doing a dissertation. It's 2 questions, really. Who are you and why are you doing this? And then the second is, let me start off this whole journey for you by giving you what I believe to be the 4 U's that I want you to keep in mind as you are beginning and as you continue through your dissertation journey. So that's kind of what we're talking about today.
And when we talk about the dissertation research, students often will feel almost immediately overwhelmed by the task at hand, confused as to how do I hone in on this topic? How do I know if I have a good topic? How do I pick a good topic? And so when we were discussing these 4 U's, they really serve as a framework to help students get clear.
Yeah, and maybe this episode is the Happy Doc podcast that Tim tells all secrets. I don't know, but I actually stole these 4 U's. I was the director of marketing for a large architectural engineering and construction firm. I used to use an iteration of these 4 U's. We used these words a lot when we would try to compel people to read what we were publishing. And so when I got hired by the university and I started working with students, I was pretty overwhelmed by the whole idea. And I thought to myself, what do I tell them? I wanted to give them something that would be valuable right up front. So, of course, I went through a lot of iterations of I'm here for you. I'll do everything I can to support you. But I was trying to come up with something. What can I start everybody with? And as I was transitioning from that job at the firm that I had for 10 years to doing dissertation work, I was going through my stuff and out popped this like little piece of paper. It kind of, it's like a little folded piece of paper that I had written a similar version of these 4 U's on there. I thought to myself, this would work. So ultimately, that's where this infrastructure comes from. And the idea is to kind of give you a sense of what it's going to take to get this project done and graduate in a reasonable amount of time. I think that's one of the things that perhaps is always good to tell students is our number one goal here is to get you out.
Sometimes it feels like we need to say that Because the students often will feel delayed by different things, or that maybe we're being overcritical or holding them back. And I think it's always good for the listeners to hear the faculty want you to finish. We want nothing more.
That's right. In fact, I was just on with a student last night, and I reminded him, remember, our goal is to make you a colleague. My goal is not to make this last forever.
I know the listeners at this point are going, give me the 4 U's. But just before we hop into that, I want to just pause and say, I love that you shared the background, because it shows that you can take something that someone's already doing or that you've done and repurpose it. I love sharing with the listeners. Not everything is novel. Almost everything people share on this podcast was borrowed or tweaked from somewhere else, right? That's how science is. Something always existed before, right? And we're improving it. So I love that you shared the history. And I also love that you share, okay, listen, as a chair, for all the chairs out there, of course, you're going to establish who are you? Why are you here? I'm here to support you. But I know a lot of faculty say, that's great, that's a foundation, but how do I actually move them forward? And it sounds like you have this great mechanism that you're using that actually gets beyond just, I'm here to support you, I'm here to mentor you through this process. But now let's kind of put the pedal to the metal and move this forward. So let's hear the U's.
Okay, the 4 U's are very simple. Good dissertation research has to be useful, unique, urgent, and ultra-specific. So useful, unique, urgent, and ultra-specific. Those are kind of the 4 U's. And in my mind, they kind of go in that order. Everything that I do with my students, whether they're writing chapter 2 or chapter 3, or whether they're just coming up with a concept paper, some places have you do a proposal, a scientific merit review, whatever it is. If you're doing these things, I always like to train my students to think in funnels. So what's at the top of the funnel? What's the widest piece down to the more specific pieces at the bottom of the funnel? So this kind of starts with useful at the top, and useful is the widest thing. But I think it's a really important thing, because what's going to compel somebody to be a part of your study? What's going to compel somebody to read something? What's going to compel somebody to take you on as a thought leader is that the information that you are presenting is useful. Now, sometimes something can seem to be really useful, and it's not. And sometimes my students will come up with what seems like a really useful idea. And then when they start looking at the literature, there's literally nobody talking about this anywhere. Now, sometimes that can mean, eureka, you've hit on something. But typically, if it's not anywhere in the literature, it's probably not that useful. Now, it might be useful in the future. We don't know, because maybe we're just not there yet. So sometimes it's not that what the student came up with is a bad idea. It's just too early.
Tim, that is such an important point, because part of the dissertation is showing you know how to fit into the field, right? Your whole chapter 2 has to be an extensive review of literature that builds up to why we should study this. So they may be ahead of their time, and that would maybe be something for them to do post their degree. But for this specific task, they need to ground it in the field. I love that you talk about useful as the first thing that you do, because that is the ultimate answer to the so what question, right?
Exactly, right. It's the ultimate answer to so what. That's exactly right. So the idea is, what can you do realistically in the next couple of years? What can you write, get approved, plan, execute, analyze, and articulate the results in, 24 months or less? If you kind of think that way, then what you can do is you can say, well, this is too big, so it's not useful for what I'm doing as well. So usefulness can be in the industry, but it also has to be useful to you. As the researcher, I want to get done. This translates well, because once you're finished with your doctorate and you start doing research outside of your doctorate, so now, like right now, a lot of us are applying for grants and monies to do research on the next thing we want to do, or whatever that is. The thing about it is that we have to scope the usefulness of our work based on how much money we're getting and how long we have to spend it. I mean, if you give me $5,000 and give me 2 years, and it cost me $25,000 in 10 years, I kind of blew it.
Right.
So the thing about it is this is good practice for you in talking about usefulness, because when we talk about usefulness, we can say, I want to get done in 24 to 30 months, let's say. What does that realistically look like? Okay, that begins for you to kind of help you understand, what can I do that's going to be useful to the industry that I'm passionate about? But it's also going to be useful for me. It's going to have that balance of, I can do this. I can also do it with kids going to school and everything else I'm going to do, right? I got all this stuff, soccer practice, aging parents, whatever's in your life, you got to figure all that stuff as well.
That useful really answers the so what to the field. Why would you do this? But also the usefulness to you as a student in a program who wants to graduate. Is it feasible?
Right. You bring up a good point, because what's buildable post-doctorate? That's the other piece I think that has to be a part of the usability. Is this is something that, I might be only studying this tiny little piece because I want to get out of school. But what am I going to do to build onto that? When I was doing mine, I had to do something pretty specific. But in the back of my mind, I had this much bigger thing that I wanted to do once I got out. And so this was just going to be a small pebble in the pond, but it was the right pebble in the right pond. And that's the thing. Truthfully, I mean, it's the best piece of college work I ever wrote, but it's the worst piece of literature I'll ever do. I mean, that's just reality. It's the first one I really did on my own. So sure, I may use it as a stepping stone only to get into the pond, but it has to be the right stone for the right pond. And that's really what you want to do. So many people come in with giant ideas, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. They have giant ideas, and I love that. I think that's great, but you don't have time to do a giant idea. But keep the giant idea in the back of your mind. And is this study useful to get to being able to do your giant idea? But don't give up your giant idea, but you just got to do it a little piece at a time.
Yeah, that pebble, that logical step is so important. So many times I see students coming with what almost feels like random ideas when they show you their ultimate end goal. Right. And you do want your dissertation work to be a logical step. And I will link to an episode that's specific to that in the show notes. But we have our first useful. Okay. And I can see how they all kind of interact with each other and overlap. So certainly as you're thinking about your research idea, you might have something that's useful and then go to unique and realize, right, oh, wait, back to the drawing board.
Right. Well, I mean, unique is interesting because there are so many things that can be unique. The best way to define unique in my mind is to ask my students to ask themselves, how is this going to be different than everybody who's ever done research about this? Well, there is a number of ways that you can do that. Let's say I want to study the correlation between apples and dental problems. I just got this passion about dentistry and dental hygiene. Well, I go out there and I realize that there are 47 research studies that pertain to fruit consumption and dental hygiene. And I think to myself, 47, I'm going to be number 48. What am I going to do different? Well, maybe my sample and population are going to be different. Or maybe I'm going to do only apples, but I'm going to do 3 different kinds of apples. Okay, well then maybe that's unique to me. Maybe I'm going to do it in Florida, where there is a much higher case of dental hygiene issues among the elderly than maybe in Ohio, where other things have been done. And so the idea is that uniqueness does not have to be brand new idea. That's not what uniqueness means. Uniqueness means, how does it point back to me as a unique researcher? That's what's important. Now, I've heard students say this in the past. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go find myself a dissertation and I'm just going to use a different instrument. Well, you have to understand that nothing is that easy, because you have to remember, even if you change instruments, you're going to have to prove that instrument. You're going to have to show why. You're going to have to show why this is what I'm going to do. And this is who said this is a good idea. It's not like you're getting a free ride. However, having said that, it sure makes it a lot easier if you find something that's already out there that you can kind of model how somebody else did their work. And you can say, well, yeah, I'm going to make it completely unique to myself because I'm going to study this other sample in this other state. I'm going to focus on seed-bearing fruits versus berries. I don't know. I mean, we're just making this stuff up, right? But now you're thinking like a researcher, because guess what? If you really got a dental hygiene passion, right, and you want to go for the big questions of dental hygiene, this is the kind of stuff you're going to have to do anyway. You're probably going to get done with this, then you're going to be doing, well, I wonder if vegetables have any correlation. You start with that, and you start building this career of becoming the nutrition expert of dental hygiene. That is how it works. And then you start putting stuff out there, and pretty soon, you got cucumbers out on social media. The idea is you're becoming an expert in something. And so uniqueness is what points it back to you. I'm not doing it just for the sake of me getting my doctorate. I'm doing it to add value. Can I add value? This goes back to useful, right? The uniqueness actually adds to its usefulness, which adds to its value in the industry. And so that's how that works.
I love how you bring up this uniqueness with two totally different ways of thinking. One is to be unique doesn't have to be this huge stretch, but at the same time, there's no free lunch. It's this balance between finding something that makes it unique, but realizing, yeah, sometimes it works to just change an instrument or change a sample. But in the end, you have to loop it back to that usefulness and say, yeah, but does doing that add to the field?
Exactly. Let me give you one really good example. Somebody will come to me with something like maximizing learning styles in education, right? Well, if there isn't a completely saturated market for that subject, I don't know of one, if that isn't one. I mean, there have been not only books written about that, but there have been countless industries built on everything from analyzation of education to implementation of education to, I mean, it's like you're going to planet number 4. It's like we're getting on a rocket ship and we're traveling to the moon, and the whole moon is full of nothing but research on this particular subject. So how are you going to make it unique? So a student might come up with something like, well, what if I do it for online learning? Yeah, but look, you've got major writers. David Merrill has been writing since the 60s on this issue of instructional design, not to mention Gagné and everybody else who's out there. So the idea is, well, how am I going to make this unique? Well, a lot of times what you have to do is you have to go a little bit deeper because there's a whole lot of information. And so I often tell people you can't transform something without information. You have to inform to transform. Everybody should read this book called The Medici Effect by Franz Johansson. If you have not read that book, The Medici Effect by Franz Johansson, you should. And I'll tell you why, because Franz Johansson does an incredible job of explaining what innovation is. Innovation is taking ideas from two different places that don't normally go together and putting them together to create something new. And so he uses Marcus Samuelsson as an example, the chef who put his Swedish mother's cuisine with his African father's cuisine and made a fusion that made him famous. He talks about so many different things like that. That's how I got these 4 U's. I said, well, I'm in this higher ed space doing this thing, but I did this marketing thing for 10 years. When I fused them together, I get the 4 U's. And now look, I'm famous. I'm on a podcast. So, I mean, that's the idea, right? It's innovative. It's an innovative way to look at something. And it isn't that anybody else couldn't have come up with it. That's not true. There isn't a person listening to this podcast who's smarter than I am. They can come up with something. Everybody can come up with something, but you got to be willing to step out of your comfortable arena, go somewhere else, and then ask yourself, how can that thing out there apply to me? I'll give you an example. I'm speaking for several conferences this year on this idea of passive engagement for virtual education. Because education typically is behind industry by about 10 years with their practices, the reason is because a tugboat can move faster than a battleship. That's just all there is to it. So what we were doing with passive engagement back in the early 2000s, we finally caught up to it now in education. So now I can do all this stuff about passive engagement, how to do drip campaigns and all these things that we did to keep our students engaged. Everybody thinks I'm a genius. All I did was just borrow all the concepts from marketing that I've ever known, how to get somebody to buy something. And now I can come and say, this is how we get a student to engage in this. We can try these concepts. So it's innovative. That's the idea. If you go out there and you start looking around, you'll get to a place that you go, hey, that could work. And then you start putting your Venn diagrams together. How do they overlap? Can it happen? And you know what? Take a big breath and try it. When it comes to uniqueness, don't be afraid to try something crazy. If it works, you're golden. If it doesn't work, well, then you got to come up with another crazy thing. When you finally find the right one that then centers everything to you, that's unique.
Yeah, so with Unique, we've got this aspect of innovation, and I'll be sure to link to that book in the show notes.
Right.
But you also brought up this idea of when we link it back to the useful, do you ever suggest that students pay attention in, say, the discussions or the end of the abstract where researchers who have gone before, like in a saturated field, will almost hand you on a silver platter, hey, this is what we know, this is what we found in this study, but here are things we still need to look at?
That's right. That's right. That is a great point. And I'm glad you brought that up. If you find a study out there that you really love, you think this is just the greatest thing, and you think what's great about this is I just know there's more that could be done with this. We're going back to this people studied fruit and dental hygiene, and you just know that there's more to this. Go to the recommended for future research section. Usually the researchers, while they've been doing this thing, the whole time you're doing these things, you're trying to stay focused on the 2 or 3 things you're looking at. That's why you write good research questions, because it just keeps you focused. You're focusing. But you'll notice that other things pop up everywhere. And it's very hard because you're always going, oh, that's interesting. And it becomes this kind of ADHD kind of thing. And you just got to keep going. Nope, I got to stay focused, But then at the end, you have a chance to tell everybody, hey, everybody, look, while I was doing this, I noticed that apples are a big deal. And you go, yes, I knew it. It's important that you understand that it's not just what the research says is important or what the research says has always been important, but it's as much what the researchers saying could be important next. And so look at the recommendation, say, I want to do something on this. And by the way, if you haven't read 30 dissertations already, you probably should. Right after you read Franz Johansson's book, you'll read 30 dissertations. I mean, I would never, ever write a sci-fi novel without having read 100 sci-fi novels. I mean, I just wouldn't do it because I don't know how they develop characters. And I would read all different authors. I would read all different kinds of sci-fi. And I would decide, here's basically the infrastructure of what I'm going to do. Well, if you're going to write a dissertation, you're going to commit 2 years or more to your life to getting this done. It would be a really good idea if you really had a good understanding of how they go, how chapter 1 feels, because they pretty much all feel the same. What does a literature review look like? Go to the back. How many references does this thing have? It's a shocker, but you got to look at it. And how did they deal with the methodology when it came to delimitations? Having those in your portfolio are important as far as just your general reading portfolio.
Yeah. And Tim, I'm glad you brought that up because I have noticed bimodal distribution with faculty in terms of ones who really recommend reading dissertations and those who say, well, wait, you need to remember those aren't peer reviewed like the scholarly research. And so, yes, while I think you should look at some, I want to make sure you're looking at good ones. Because what I have seen in the past is a student might get their hands on a dissertation that isn't quite up to that university standards, or things have changed in the industry. Do you just tell students, go out there, I want you to read a bunch, or do you like to pick and choose the ones that they read?
So I know that I can always hand my students 2 or 3 that I know are really good, focus on these. But then I tell them, and you find some others, you just need to compare them to what I've given you. So I don't really need to give you 30. I just need to give you 1, 2 or 3. Yeah. And you need to figure out how to compare them. You're going to find out that if this one is just not very good, but it still doesn't mean that you couldn't look at it though and say, oh, that was an interesting way that they described their assumptions. I never really thought of it. I mean, there might be some value in it, but you're right. I mean, there's a lot of bad stuff out there.
So anything, have a balance. Maybe ask your chair for a couple of exemplars, but as you're getting into your specific area, read them, but read them with that really critical eye, remembering this is the first time this person, just like you said when you started the podcast, your dissertation is the first big scholarly work you're putting out there. Right. It's only going to get better from there.
That's right. And notice what you feel like when you're in the middle of the 3rd paragraph on page 22. This sentence, this whole paragraph that you're talking about, this particular thing about apples, it just doesn't make any sense. I don't know how it connects to anything. Okay. So how do you avoid doing that? And
the more you read, I truly believe the better you write, regardless of what it is that you're reading. Mm-hmm. You can identify the type of writing that engages you and is unbiased, and you can emulate that, and you can identify the writing that is disconnected and incoherent and isn't telling a clear story, and you can cross-check yourself when you're writing and make sure that you're not doing that.
That's right.
So we've got useful, we've got unique, and number 3 was urgent.
Right. The problem is that if you're going to compel people to read something, because I mean, why would anybody write a dissertation that no one was going to read? If you're really trying to make this a stepping stone into the next thing you're going to do, it's really important that this piece has some urgency, right? So with urgency, it's the ultimate so what. So if we don't do this, what happens? If I say, I want to study the correlation of students and their standardized test scores during the global pandemic, and just right after that, in big parentheses, yawn here. There is just nobody cares. They're going to go next, right? If I say, I want to focus on how to make remote learning successful so our students don't lose years of learning, you got to talk in a way that's urgent. And so if this doesn't get studied, what's going to happen? We're going to lose 10 years because what we do now is going to have an effect for 10 years of their education. And so we were forced into this, and now we have these problems, and look at these test scores. That's what I'm talking about. See, now I'm going to go click. I'm going to read that. I'm going to read that if I'm a researcher in education. If I'm a person that builds courses, I'm going to go find that article, because all of you are going to do the right thing, and you're going to turn your dissertation into an article. That's another podcast episode. Nobody reads a dissertation. So what you want to do is publish your dissertation into several articles, but each article is going to have urgency if they're going to click on it. So you have to have this sense of, why am I doing this? Because listen, there is urgency in understanding how this works, because our children's education is at risk. Okay, now we're burning down things, right? Now we're metaphorically on fire. And the thing is, this is the tricky part about writing a dissertation and about doing doctoral work in general. You have to do this without preaching at us, because it's an academic voice thing, right? It's not, and the children will die. You can't do that. You can't. You can if that's what you're going to do. If you're going to go out there and stand in the corner and with your bullhorn and you're going to shout at the buildings, you can do that. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's not academic writing. Academic writing is, look, I've put all these pieces together and I've led you on this journey. Do you see it? Do you see that this is serious, what we're talking about? I don't even have to tell you it's serious. I just have to show you the data. I don't have to inject myself in this at all, because it's obvious to me and everybody else that when you put A, B, C, D, E together, you add them all up and divide them by 5, we have a terrible scenario. Do you see it? And they go, we see it. Next page. What are we going to do? Tell us what happens. That's the idea, right? And when we talk about urgency, it locks in with usefulness. If I'm talking about something that's not useful, there's no way it's going to be urgent. Use the literature to prove the urgency. Everything is scaffolded and informed by the literature, everything. So if we want reform or transformation, we have to have information that compels us to react because of the urgency. If you take me down the journey and you show me, do you see it? It started here and there was only this little bit of problem. And we did this and it got worse. And then we did this and it got a little bit better. But then this happened and it got worse. And by the way, 3 other researchers in their work also say that this is a compelling problem. And unique to me, I want to study this piece of this problem and see if that adds some value to how to solve the problem. You're not going to solve the whole problem of remote children and their learning in virtual environments and how that's going to affect them going to college. You're not going to be able to study the whole thing for your dissertation, but you are going to be able to study this tiny little piece. Your dissertation is one little match that lights one piece of the fire that is part of the greater fire. If you can do that, then that urgency will propel you forward, and it also keeps you motivated. Because if you really do see the urgency, you're not making this up. The urgency in academic research is, if we don't do something about this, there's a cataclysmic problem coming. And so I'm just one researcher, but I'm among many colleagues that are saying the same thing. So that's urgency.
And with urgency, I love that you bring in, you need to make this compelling case, but it also shouldn't be reading like a drama.
Right.
A reality TV show.
Exactly.
There needs to be this academic voice. And sometimes when I get a piece of work that may be very engaging, very entertaining, nowhere near academic writing, often I will counter with, can you get me some numbers? Let the research show what happens when the learning is hindered, not just with test scores, but what happens when they get into the marketplace? What happens to the economy? What happens to their individual household income? If you can get me some numbers, a lot of times that helps be a little more diplomatic while at the same time building this case, this sense of urgency.
That's right. That's right. Many times people are studying things that have had a dramatic impact on them. So there's an emotional connection. By the way, I would highly recommend not doing something that you're highly emotionally connected to, because it's really hard to separate it. But sometimes, you know what? You just got to do it. It's just something that's been bothering you for a long time. You want to be a part of the solution. I never tell my students not to do it. But
Tim, I'm like you. I never tell people not to do something, but I will
right,
say I'm going to give you a lot of information that may help you make a better decision, because I do believe people's passion can be their pitfall. And I actually write about
that's
this.
right.
There's a free download on my website. But yeah, it's something that you want to at least be aware of.
That's right. That's right. And remember too, you always got to keep in mind, is this useful for you going forward?
Yes.
You know, and so a lot of times what happens is, can you just prove it to me with the literature without inserting your own opinion or your own emotion in it? Can you just show me how the literature makes this case, and that it's as compelling as you feel like it is? If you can, then okay, you could actually do a project on this, because it really is a problem. Now, where you're going to have trouble sometimes is still separating that out. But if you can't really prove it, but it's been something that's really bothered you or something that's affected you, I get that. And I think there's a place for you to work that out within the industry, but it may not be the best thing to spend the next 2 years on. I think you said it well. I never tell anybody what to do, but I can almost predict that they're going to hit the wall, because it's just too personal, and that doesn't always translate well to research.
A good test that I sometimes recommend is, when you write, your reader shouldn't know how you feel about this particular subject. And if you can't write without kind of showing your hand, it might not be a good choice. But we could do a whole episode on that. Let's go to ultra specific. This one is super important.
Right. So if the whole world of everything we know is a wall, right? So it's the great wall of all knowledge of everything that we know, everything. The wall is made up of giant bricks, like a whole industry would be a brick. Everything about education is a brick. You know, everything that we know about politics is a brick. Everything we know about communication is a brick. So the bricks are these giant pieces, right? Let's say this wall has 1 million of those bricks, and every one of those bricks is made up of 100 million tiny little sand crystals. That's your work.
A grain of sand.
Tiny little grain of sand. That's it. And if you think that to yourself, then ultra specific will make sense to you. Now, if you can't find it in the literature, you're too specific. I'll use my AI example. If I go out there and I'll say the use of Oculus AI devices versus other kind of devices for integration into history classes of third graders, that's way too specific. You can be too ultra specific. The idea is not that you're being ultra specific to the point of microscopic, right? The reason that I use the grain of sand is I don't need a microscope to look at it. I can hold the little piece of sand in my hand and I can look at it. I can see it. So it's realizable from a human standpoint. And so sometimes when we go too microscopic, what happens is it disappears, because I got to get everybody to the microscope. We want to be able to hold something up and say, you see this grain of sand? Everybody goes, yes. Okay, this little grain of sand. But at the same time, I'm not writing a brick. And a lot of times what people want to write is their own brick, which it's never going to happen.
When your chair says we need to narrow this down, listen.
Right. That's right. I have a distinct, valuable advantage to you. I finished. Look, I'm not smarter than you. I'm not more innovative than you. I'm not better at school than you are. I'm not more favored by the university, certainly, than you are. I haven't met anybody that did a dissertation that didn't use the word brutal, difficult, life-changing. It's life-changing. Yes. Most people I meet, if they do their dissertation, they come out extremely humbled, right? Because it's a humbling thing. I mean, it is refining. You're getting gold by turning up the heat. When I finished, I was bruised, battered, bloodied, out of time, out of money, out of energy. I had no new two thoughts to roll together. I was done. I did everything I could to do my defense. And after my defense, I just cried for an hour. I was so exhausted. And for me to now sit here and say, well, I just have all the answers for everything, that it's crazy. And the thing about it is that part of the humility of it is, at the end of it, you realize that you just spent 24 months studying the most infinitesimally small thing ever. But what happens is, in that moment of humility, if you step back and you look at this giant wall made of bricks, and you can say to yourself, yeah, but that's my little speck right there.
I contributed my 1 grain of sand.
I have my 1 grain of sand, and this wall would not be the same without my 1 grain of sand. So part of the humbling experience of doing it is realizing that you're not going to build a brick. You're just going to build a speck. And the thing is that look how much work we had to do just to build a speck. So when somebody comes into my life and says something like, well, I mean, if I were going to change education, here's what I would do. You think to yourself, well, you have not seen the wall. You just haven't seen it. You all who are listening to this podcast, you have actually been at the wall. You've seen it. And you're working on the little speck that you're going to put in, and you're going to go, I did it. That's why ultra specificity to me is so powerful. It's because it seems indistinct and unrecognizable, but it's not. It's not, because the whole wall is made up of this sand, the whole thing. And so when we look at it, look at the tiny little sand crystals. That's really what you're doing. And so every course that you take, every paper you write, every annotated bibliography that you write, everything, take what they have to give you. If they tell you your APA isn't right, or whatever you're using, if they tell you that your voice isn't good enough, if they tell you that you're too redundant, that you're using too many colloquialisms, that you're not citing enough references, that you're not, just go, okay, and try your best not to say, I'm not smart enough. You are. But listen, I don't know very many marathon runners that train by running marathons. What they do is they train by running 10 miles, 12 miles, 13 miles. They run 5Ks every day. And then the thing about it is, what they do is when they get to the day of the marathon, they do everything that they know. And then they run. And about mile 13, 14, or 15, they have to dig deep. And they got to dig deep to get that last 7 miles in. And most of them come across exhausted. I don't know if you've ever watched a marathon, but they come across, they're all laying on the ground. They're huffing and puffing. That's the way it is. We have been highly trained as students, but now you are about to do the last 7 miles of the marathon. And so expect it, embrace it, and realize that you are going to emerge on the other side completely a different person. And you're going to be very valuable to your industry as an expert. And so go for it and realize that you're not alone. You're never alone.
Tim, thank you for so many nuggets of wisdom. And we talk a lot on this podcast about the transformational nature of a doctoral journey, and that there are a lot of times where it's going to be uncomfortable. However, when we have someone on like you who can share a framework that can give you a model with asking yourself, is it useful? Is it unique? Is it urgent? Is it ultra specific? It can shorten your time on the road. If we're going to go with the marathon analogy, maybe it can shave off a few miles and get you to the end with a little more of your stamina in place.
Right.
So I want to thank you for sharing that with us today. And
Sure.
I always like to end with asking, and you've already given us so many great little gems here, but do you have a favorite quote or any final words of wisdom you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah, there's an old ancient proverb that says this: acquire wisdom, acquire understanding. Do not forget or turn away from the words and the ideas that you've learned, because the beginning of wisdom is to acquire wisdom. And in all of your acquisition, gain understanding. That's the piece, is that we can acquire all of the knowledge in the world, but we will never be wise unless we understand. And so seek understanding. You'll shave some time off your marathon.
Well, Tim, again, thank you so much. And I look forward to having you back again real soon.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening, and I look forward to connecting with you on the next episode. The Happy Doc Student Podcast is brought to you by expandyourhappy.com, and you can learn more there. Oh, and hey, if you want to make my day, would you rate, review, and subscribe to this show? One more thing. Just a quick reminder that the information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only.